80 Iranian fast boats, 1 United States carrier strike group. On paper, the result looks obvious. But naval analysts who have modeled this scenario consistently reach a different and more unsettling conclusion. If 80 Iranian fast attack craft were to simultaneously swarm the USS Gerald R. Ford in the restricted waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the engagement would likely represent the greatest test of modern naval doctrine in history. In this scenario, the engagement would not begin with a single shot, but with a massive, coordinated surge of electronic and physical signatures. If these forces were to meet, the United States Navy would be forced to transition from a peacetime posture to a high-intensity defensive state in a matter of seconds. Defense analysts have modeled this specific threat for decades. Yet, the introduction of the Gerald R. Ford-class carrier adds new variables to the equation. This is not a battle of individual platforms, but a battle of systems. On one side is the most technologically advanced warship ever built, a vessel costing over $13 billion and carrying a full air wing of FA-18 fighters and F-35 Charlie aircraft. On the other side is a force of 80 small, low-profile, and highly maneuverable craft, each costing less than a single American missile, yet collectively representing a threat that could theoretically overwhelm even the most sophisticated radar and weapon systems. If this engagement were to occur, the primary challenge for the carrier strike group would be the sheer density of the threat environment. War game analysts suggest that the Strait of Hormuz, which at its narrowest point is only 21 nautical miles wide, creates a unique geographical disadvantage for a large aircraft carrier. In a hypothetical engagement, the Gerald R. Ford would be operating in a littoral box, an area where its primary advantage, long-range air power, is partially mitigated by the short distances involved. Analysts believe that the Iranian naval doctrine is specifically designed to exploit this proximity. Instead of meeting the United States Navy in the open ocean, Iranian forces would likely wait until the carrier strike group is deep within the strait, where the reaction time for defensive systems is compressed to its absolute limit. In this hypothetical scenario, the 80 boats would not arrive as a single, disorganized mass. According to Iranian naval doctrine, the flotilla would likely be divided into multiple wolf packs of 10 to 15 vessels each. These packs would approach from different vectors simultaneously, a tactic known as a saturation attack. If this scenario unfolded, the Aegis combat system on the accompanying Arleigh Burke class destroyers would be required to track and prioritize dozens of high-speed surface targets while simultaneously scanning for potential aerial or subsurface threats. The question that keeps Pentagon planners awake is not whether the carrier can hit a fast boat, but whether it can hit 80 of them before one or more can close within striking distance, based on known capabilities. The Gerald R. Ford is equipped with the AN/SPY-6 dual band radar, a system designed to detect smaller targets at greater distances than previous generations. However, even with this technological edge, the physical reality of 80 targets creates a data saturation risk. Analysts suggest that if the swarm were to close the distance at speeds exceeding 40 knots, the engagement window for the carrier's defensive layers would likely be less than 10 minutes. In that time, the strike group would have to identify which boats are carrying anti-ship cruise missiles and which are decoys or armed only with heavy machine guns. In a hypothetical engagement of this scale, the outcome would likely depend on the strike group's ability to maintain situational awareness under extreme pressure. If the Iranian boats were to successfully use the rugged coastline and civilian maritime traffic as cover, they could potentially reduce the detection range of the United States forces. Wargame models predict that the first 3 minutes of the engagement would be the most critical. This analysis will examine what would likely happen if the world's most advanced carrier was forced to defend itself against the ultimate numbers problem. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. To understand why this engagement would be a significant challenge for a modern carrier strike group, defense analysts first examine the specific capabilities and doctrine of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. In this hypothetical scenario, the 80-boat flotilla would not be a collection of civilian skiffs, but a structured force of purpose-built fast attack craft and fast inshore attack craft. Iranian doctrine does not seek to match the United States Navy ship for ship in a conventional sense. Instead, it relies on the principle of asymmetric mass. The backbone of this swarm would likely consist of Zulfiqar and Tandar-class fast attack craft, based on known capabilities. The Zulfiqar is a high-speed catamaran capable of speeds exceeding 50 knots. Its primary threat to a carrier strike group lies in its armament, typically 2 Nasr-1 or C-704 anti-ship cruise missiles. These missiles are designed for short-range engagements, with an operational reach of approximately 20 miles. In a hypothetical engagement, these weapons would be particularly dangerous because of their sea-skimming flight profile, which allows them to travel just meters above the water's surface, making them difficult for traditional radar to detect until they are very close to their target. Beyond the missile-carrying craft, analysts believe the swarm would include dozens of smaller Boghammer-style boats. While these vessels lack long-range missiles, they are often equipped with multiple launch rocket systems, heavy machine guns, and even man-portable air defense systems. In this scenario, these smaller craft would serve a dual purpose. First, they would act as kinetic decoys, forcing the carrier's defensive systems to do on low-value targets. Second, they would provide suppression fire, aiming to damage the sensitive radar arrays and communication antennas on the exterior of the United States ships. Analysts note that even a lucky hit from a rocket-propelled grenade or a heavy machine gun could potentially degrade a destroyer's ability to guide its own missiles, creating a mission kill to sink the vessel. One of the most significant advantages of this force in a hypothetical engagement is its extremely low radar cross-section. Because these boats are small and often constructed from composite materials, they are difficult to distinguish from the clutter of the sea surface, especially in high-wave conditions. If this scenario unfolded in the Strait of Hormuz, the proximity of land would further complicate the picture. Defense analysts suggest that Iranian forces would likely utilize the radar shadows created by the numerous islands in the strait to mask their approach. By the time a carrier's radar could achieve a firm lock on the incoming swarm, the boats might already be within the inner defensive layer. Furthermore, the Iranian command and control structure for such an operation is designed to be highly decentralized. If these forces were to meet, the flotilla would likely operate under a disciplined chaos model. Rather than relying on a single flagship that could be easily neutralized, each wolf pack would have its own tactical objectives. Wargame models indicate that this makes the swarm incredibly resilient. Even if 50% of the boats were destroyed in the first few minutes, the remaining 40 boats would likely continue their high-speed approach, adhering to a doctrine that emphasizes the sacrifice of individual units to achieve a collective breach of the enemy's defenses. However, analysts also recognize significant limitations within the swarm. The fast boats are inherently fragile. A single hit from a 25mm cannon or a Hellfire missile from a helicopter would likely destroy a craft instantly. Additionally, Their small size limits the sophistication of their own sensors. In a hypothetical engagement, they would likely be reliant on external data links or visual targeting, both of which are vulnerable to the United States Navy's superior electronic warfare capabilities. In summary, the Iranian force in this scenario represents a glass cannon extremely lethal and capable of overwhelming high-end defenses through sheer numbers, but lacking any individual staying power. The success of their doctrine depends entirely on the saturation threshold, the point at which the number of incoming threats exceeds the number of available defensive rounds in the strike group's magazines. This is the calculated gamble of the swarm. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. While the Iranian swarm relies on mass and proximity, the United States Navy counters with the most sophisticated, integrated defensive network ever deployed at sea. In this hypothetical engagement, the centerpiece of this defense is the USS Gerald R. Ford, supported by its escort of Arleigh Burke class destroyers. If these forces were to meet, the primary objective of the strike group would be to maintain a bubble of protection that no Iranian craft could penetrate. The first line of defense for the strike group is the AN/SPY-6 radar system. Analysts believe this radar is a generational leap over previous technology, capable of tracking significantly more targets with much higher resolution. In this scenario, the AN/SPY-6 radar would be tasked with the monumental job of discriminating 80 high-speed surface contacts from the background noise of the sea. Defense analysts have noted that the Gerald R. Ford's increased power generation, nearly 3 times that of a Nimitz-class carrier, allows its sensors to run at higher intensities for longer periods. This would likely provide the strike group commander with a clearer tactical picture than was ever possible in the past. Supporting the carrier are at least 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, each equipped with the Aegis combat system. This system is designed to link every sensor and weapon in the strike group into a single, unified network. If the swarm were to approach, the destroyers would likely act as the outer shield. Each destroyer carries 90 to 96 vertical launch system cells. However, in a hypothetical engagement against 80 targets, a significant vulnerability emerges: magazine depth. If each boat requires 2 missiles to ensure a kill, the destroyers could theoretically exhaust their supply of Standard Missile 6 or evolved Sea Sparrow missiles before the swarm is neutralized. Analysts suggest that the most effective tool against a swarm is not a missile, but the carrier's air wing. In this scenario, the MH-60 Sierra helicopters would be the first responders. Armed with Hellfire missiles and 20mm cannons, these aircraft are specifically trained for surface warfare missions against small craft. Because they operate from the air, they are immune to many of the weapons carried by the Iranian boats. Wargame models predict that a single MH-60 Sierra could potentially neutralize 4 to 6 fast boats before needing to return to the carrier to rearm. If the swarm were to breach the outer missile and air defenses, the engagement would enter its most dangerous phase, the inner layer. For the Gerald R. Ford, this includes the rolling airframe missile and the evolved Sea Sparrow missile systems, which are designed for high speed, close-in threats. The final line of defense is the close-in weapon system, a radar-guided 20mm Gatling gun capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute. While devastatingly effective, the close-in weapon system is a point defense weapon with a very short range. Doctrine indicates that if the strike group is forced to rely on these guns, the Iranian boats have already reached a position where they can potentially damage the carrier. A critical vulnerability often highlighted by defense analysts is the reload gap The vertical launch systems on the destroyers cannot be reloaded at sea. Once a ship has fired its complement of missiles, it is effectively removed from the long-range engagement. In a hypothetical saturation attack of 80 boats, the United States Navy would be forced to decide between expending its high-end missiles on small boats or saving them for a potential secondary missile strike from the Iranian mainland. Analysts believe that this dilemma of resources is a primary goal of the Iranian swarm doctrine. Furthermore, the Aegis combat system, while unparalleled in its ability to track aircraft and missiles, must deal with the unique physics of the Strait of Hormuz. The proximity of the shoreline can create clutter that may confuse even the most advanced automated targeting algorithms. If this scenario unfolded, the strike group would likely rely heavily on human-in-the-loop decision-making to prevent the system from being overwhelmed by decoys. This analysis suggests that while the Aegis shield is incredibly robust, it is not infinite. Its strength lies in its layers, but its weakness lies in the finite number of bullets in its magazines. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. In a hypothetical engagement within the narrow confines of the Strait of Hormuz, the transition from a tense standoff to active combat would likely occur in a matter of seconds. Based on known doctrine, the opening phase of this scenario would be defined by a rapid breakout of Iranian forces from coastal concealment. If this engagement were to occur, the United States Navy would likely detect the initial movement of the 80 boats via the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, airborne early warning aircraft, patrolling high above the strike group. Wargame analysts suggest that the first 3 minutes would be a frantic race for tactical dominance. As the 80 fast boats surge from behind the radar shadows of various islands, they would likely adopt a wide, dispersed formation to maximize the area the United States sensors must cover. In this scenario, the carrier strike group commander would likely immediately order the launch of all alert aircraft. If this scenario unfolded, the most critical assets would not be the heavy F-35 Charlie fighters, but the MH-60 Sierra helicopters already in the air or on the deck of the Gerald R. Ford. Analysis suggests that the engagement would likely begin at a range of approximately 15 to 20 miles. At this distance, the Arleigh Burke class destroyers would likely be authorized to engage the most high-threat targets, specifically those identified as carrying anti-ship cruise missiles, using Standard Missile 6 or Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. However, doctrine indicates a significant constraint. Firing a multi-million-dollar missile at a small boat is a mathematically unsustainable strategy if 80 targets are closing the distance. Therefore, analysts believe the United States would likely rely on its helicopters to perform interdiction during these opening minutes. If this engagement were to occur, the MH-60 Sierra helicopters would likely use their AGM-114 Hellfire missiles to pick off the lead Iranian vessels. These missiles, while smaller than the Standard series, are highly effective against unarmored hulls. In a hypothetical engagement, one helicopter could potentially neutralize 4 fast boats in a single pass. However, Iranian doctrine would likely counter this by utilizing man-portable air defense systems from the decks of the boats. If these forces were to meet, the helicopters would be forced to operate in a high-threat environment, popping up from behind the horizon to fire before diving back down to avoid incoming surface-to-air fire. As the swarm crosses the 15-mile threshold, the saturation effect would likely begin to manifest. Wargame models predict that the sheer volume of incoming data would force the Aegis combat system into its most intensive processing mode. While the ANSPY-6 radar on the Gerald R Ford is designed to handle hundreds of tracks. The human operators in the Combat Direction Center would be faced with the identification friend or foe dilemma. In the crowded waters of the strait, dozens of civilian tankers and fishing vessels would likely be interspersed with the 80 Iranian craft. If this scenario unfolded, the risk of collateral damage would be extreme, as the United States forces would need to determine in seconds which radar blip represents a lethal threat and which represents a neutral bystander. Based on historical precedent and observed exercises, the Iranian flotilla would likely respond to the initial United States fire by accelerating to their maximum speed of over 40 knots. Doctrine calls for the boats to weave and crisscross their paths, a tactic specifically designed to complicate the fire control solutions of the carrier's automated weapons systems. Analysts believe that by the end of the first 5 minutes, the outer layer of the defense would likely have neutralized 15 to 20 boats, but the remaining 60 would likely have closed to within 10 miles of the carrier. In this scenario, the engagement would rapidly shift from a long-range missile exchange to a medium-range skirmish. The sound of the first missiles launching from the destroyers would likely be heard across the strait, signaling the end of the opening phase and the beginning of a high-stakes escalation. Defense analysts have noted that this is the moment where the carrier's massive size becomes a liability, as it becomes a magnet for every weapon the remaining boats can bring to bear. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. As the engagement enters its 6th minute, the distance between the Iranian flotilla and the carrier strike group would likely shrink to under 7 miles. This is the transition zone, where the nature of the combat changes from a clinical supply, long-range missile exchange to a chaotic, multi-vector brawl. If this scenario unfolded, the most critical decision point for the United States commander would be the transition of the primary defensive burden from the destroyers to the carrier's own organic weapon systems and the shorter-range cannons of the escort ships. In this hypothetical escalation, the United States Navy would likely deploy its most potent non-kinetic weapon, electronic warfare, the Gerald R. Ford is equipped with the ANSLQ-32 Block 3 electronic warfare suite, designed to jam the radar and communication links of incoming threats. Analysts believe that as the swarm closes in, the strike group would attempt to blind the Iranian boats, severing their connection to land-based command centers and confusing their onboard guidance systems. However, Iranian doctrine accounts for this. If these forces were to meet, the Iranian crews are trained to operate under emissions control or silent conditions, relying on visual cues and pre-planned maneuver patterns if their radios and GPS are jammed. As the jamming intensifies, the physical escalation would likely involve the first use of the 5-inch guns on the Arleigh Burke class destroyers, capable of firing 20 rounds per minute. These guns provide a sustained, high-volume fire that missiles cannot match. In this scenario, the destroyers would likely use fragmentation, or air-burst rounds, designed to explode just above the water's surface. Wargame models suggest that this would create a wall of steel through which the Iranian boats must pass. However, with 60 boats still active and approaching from multiple directions, even this volume of fire would likely be unable to track every target. Analysis suggests that this is the moment where the rear-load gap becomes a tactical reality. By this point, the destroyers would likely have expended a significant portion of their ready-to-fire Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. If the swarm continues to press the attack, the United States forces would be forced to shift to their 25mm Bushmaster cannons and the close-in weapon systems. This represents a significant escalation in risk. While these weapons are highly accurate, They have an effective range of only about 2 miles. If this scenario occurred, the Iranian boats would be close enough for their crews to see the hulls of the American ships with the naked eye. Based on doctrine, the Iranian response to this wall of fire would likely be the simultaneous launch of every available anti-ship cruise missile in the flotilla. Analysts call this the saturation peak. If 20 or 30 Nasr-1 missiles were launched from different boats at different angles, the Aegis combat system would reach its maximum processing threshold. Even a 95% intercept rate, which would be an extraordinary feat of engineering, would still allow 1 or 2 missiles to leak through the defensive screen. In a hypothetical engagement of this intensity, the Gerald R, Ford would likely begin aggressive maneuvering to present the smallest possible target and to maximize the firing arcs of its defensive guns. This is the critical moment where doctrine is tested against reality. The United States Navy emphasizes defense in depth. But as the swarm enters the 3-mile threshold, those layers have effectively compressed into a single, final line of resistance. The sound of the engagement would now be a continuous roar of rapid-fire cannons and the screech of missiles leaving their rails. Analysts believe that in this phase, the strike group would likely suffer its first mission-critical damage. While the carrier's heavy armor is designed to withstand significant impacts, its soft systems, the radar arrays, the flight deck, and the catapults are vulnerable to even small-caliber fire or near misses from rockets. If this scenario continued to escalate, the question would no longer be, can the carrier survive? But can the, say, carrier still perform its mission? This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. The engagement now enters its most volatile phase, the moment of saturation. Analysts believe that as the remaining Iranian flotilla, estimated at roughly 45 to 50 vessels, crosses the 4-mile threshold, the tactical situation would reach a tipping point. In this scenario, the Iranian commanders would likely execute their primary mission objective, the simultaneous launch of every remaining Vampire, the military term for incoming anti-ship missiles. If this engagement were to occur, the critical moment would be defined by the physical limits of the Aegis combat system's fire control. While the AN/SPY-6 radar can track hundreds of targets, a ship only has a finite number of illuminators, or data links to guide intercepting missiles. In this hypothetical saturation, wargame models suggest that if 30 missiles were launched from 4 different bearings simultaneously, the defensive screen would be forced to prioritize targets based on time to impact. This creates a mathematical window where a second or third wave of missiles could potentially find an opening while the system is busy servicing the first. In this scenario, one of the Arleigh Burke class destroyers would likely be the focus of a coordinated Wolfpack strike. Analysis suggests that while the carrier is the ultimate prize, the Iranian doctrine would likely call for neutralizing the escorts. First, to peel the onion of the strike group's defense. If this scenario unfolded, a destroyer would likely be engaging 3 fast boats to its port side with 25mm cannons while simultaneously attempting to intercept 4 incoming Nasr-1 missiles from its starboard side. Defense analysts believe that in such a high-density environment, the probability of kill for defensive systems begins to degrade. If a single Nasr-1 missile were to leak through the evolved Sea Sparrow missile layer, it would trigger the activation of the close-in weapon system. The sound of the 20mm Gatling gun would signal that the threat is less than 2,000 yards away, roughly 10 seconds from impact. Based on known capabilities, while the close-in weapon system is highly effective, it is a point defense weapon. If it successfully destroys the incoming missile, the resulting debris traveling at several hundred miles per hour would still likely impact the ship's superstructure. In this hypothetical exchange, wargame analysts predict that at least one Arleigh Burke class destroyer would likely suffer a mission kill. In naval terminology, a mission kill means the ship remains afloat, but its combat systems, sensors, or engines are damaged to the point where it can no longer perform its role in the battle. If a missile were to strike the Aegis's radar arrays or the communication mast, the destroyer would effectively be blinded. This would leave a significant blind spot in the carrier's defensive bubble, which the remaining Iranian fast boats would likely move to exploit immediately. If these forces were to meet the Gerald R, Ford would be forced to use its own Standard Missile 6 and rolling airframe missile launchers to cover the gap left by the damaged escort. This is the moment where the carrier is most vulnerable. Doctrine indicates that the carrier would likely increase speed to 30 knots, performing a breakout maneuver to put distance between itself and the center of the swarm. However, as the carrier turns, it exposes its massive side profile to the remaining boats. Analysts believe the critical moment is not just about the missiles, but about the cognitive load on the sailors. In this scenario, the tactical action officers would be making life or death decisions every 2 seconds. If the Iranian swarm successfully maintains its discipline and continues to close the distance despite heavy losses, the psychological pressure on the defenders would be immense. Wargame models indicate that this is where human error is most likely to occur. A missed target identification or a slight delay in weapon authorization could be the difference between a successful intercept and a catastrophic hit. The critical moment concludes when the first major impact occurs, whether it is a direct missile hit on an escort or a saturation of the carrier's innermost defense. The invincibility of the strike group is pierced. From this point forward, the engagement is no longer about prevention, but about damage limitation and survival. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. If this exchange were to reach its peak, the 3-mile radius around the Gerald R, Ford would become one of the most violent and high-density combat zones in the history of naval warfare. In this hypothetical scenario, the remaining 30 to 40 Iranian fast boats would have successfully bypassed the strike group's outer and middle layers of defense, having survived the Standard Missile 6 and Hellfire engagements. These vessels would now be within range to utilize their entire kinetic arsenal, including unguided rockets, heavy machine guns, and short-range anti-ship missiles. Analysis suggests that at this distance, the primary burden of defense would shift to the carrier's close-in weapon systems and its 25mm Bushmaster cannons. In a hypothetical engagement, the Phalanx Gatling guns would be firing in their surface mode, a setting specifically calibrated to track and neutralize high-speed waterborne threats. The sound of these guns, a continuous low-pitched growl, would be audible across the flight deck as they unleashed thousands of rounds per minute. However, wargame models predict a significant physical limitation: the magazine exhaustion factor. Each close-in weapon system mount holds approximately 1,500 rounds. In a saturation attack involving dozens of targets, a single mount could expend its entire ready-use magazine in less than 30 seconds of sustained fire. In this scenario, the Iranian crews would likely utilize coordinated distraction tactics. Doctrine indicates that half of the remaining boats would act as fire sponges, maneuvering aggressively and firing unguided rockets to draw the attention of the automated defensive systems. Meanwhile, the remaining boats, the strike pack, would focus on a single vector of approach, attempting to find a gap in the firing arcs. Analysts believe that if these forces were to meet, the Iranian boats would aim specifically for the islands and sensor masts of the United States ships, even without sinking the carrier. A massed volley of rockets and heavy machine gun fire would likely degrade the Ford's dual-band radar arrays, which are mounted high on the superstructure. If this scenario unfolded, the Gerald R, Ford would likely experience multiple impact events. While the carrier's hull is constructed of quartz, thick, reinforced steel designed to withstand significant blast pressure, its flight deck and hangar bays are relatively vulnerable. Defense analysts suggest that a single Nasser-1 missile, carrying a 300-pound high-explosive warhead, would likely not sink a 100,000-ton carrier. However, if it were to impact the flight deck or an aircraft elevator, it would likely cause a mission kill by preventing the launch and recovery of aircraft. In this hypothetical exchange, the carrier would be like a heavyweight boxer being peppered by dozens of light, fast strikes. The individual hits are survivable, but the cumulative damage to the eyes and ears of the ship could be devastating, based on known capabilities. The Arleigh Burke class destroyers would likely be in a desperate struggle to protect their charge. One destroyer, already suffering from a mission kill to its primary radar, would likely be forced to rely on manual optical targeting for its remaining guns. In this scenario, the sound of 25mm cannons and the splashes of Iranian rockets would create a chaotic environment where clear communication becomes nearly impossible. Analysts believe that at least 40 to 50% of the original Iranian swarm would likely be destroyed in this phase, their wreckage creating a debris field that would further complicate radar tracking for the defenders. In this hypothetical exchange, the fog of war would be literal. Smoke from burning fast boats and the exhaust from dozens of missiles would likely obscure the visual range of the United States crews. If the Iranian boats were to use smoke screens of their own, as their doctrine suggests, the carrier's thermal and infrared sensors would be tested to their absolute limits. Wargame models indicate that this is the moment where the technological gap between the two forces is at its narrowest, in the close quarters brawl of the inner layer. The high-end sensors of the Ford are often no more effective than the steady hands of a sailor behind a machine gun. Ultimately, this phase of the engagement would be a test of endurance. For every Iranian boat that is neutralized, 2 more would likely be attempting to close the distance. This analysis suggests that while the United States Navy would likely inflict staggering losses on the Iranian flotilla, the saturation math remains a sobering reality. If 80 boats start the engagement, and the defense has a 90% success rate, 8 boats will still reach the target. In the logic of asymmetric warfare, for the Iranian commander, 8 boats reaching the carrier constitutes a tactical success. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. After approximately 15 minutes of high-intensity combat, the hypothetical engagement in the Strait of Hormuz would likely reach a bloody conclusion. In this scenario, the saturation peak would pass as the remaining Iranian forces, depleted by over 75%, realize that the saturation threshold has not been fully breached. Analysis suggests that the Iranian commander would likely order the remaining 12 to 15 fast boats to break contact and retreat toward the jagged coastline, utilizing their superior speed and local knowledge to vanish into the radar clutter of the Iranian mainland. If this scenario were to occur, the field of battle would be a sobering sight for naval analysts. Based on known capabilities and the intensity of the exchange, the Iranian flotilla would be effectively neutralized as a cohesive fighting force. Roughly 65 to 70 fast attack craft would likely be destroyed, their hulls either sunk or left as burning wrecks scattered across the narrow waterway. In this hypothetical outcome, the IRGCN would have sacrificed the vast majority of its regional surface capability in a single, massive gamble. However, the cost to the United States Navy would be equally significant, marking this as a victory with heavy cost. If these forces were to meet, the Gerald R. Ford would likely remain afloat, but its status as an operational platform would be severely compromised. Analysis suggests the carrier would likely have suffered at least one direct hit from a Nasser-1 missile, and multiple impacts from unguided rockets and heavy machine guns. While the Ford's damage control teams are among the best in the world, a missile impact on the flight deck or near the island superstructure would likely result in a mission kill. In this scenario, the carrier would likely be unable to launch or recover its remaining FA-18 or F-35 Charlie aircraft, effectively removing its primary offensive teeth from the theater. Furthermore, the escort screen would likely have suffered even more direct damage. One Arleigh Burke class destroyer would likely be mission killed and dead in the water, having absorbed the brunt of the saturation attack to protect the carrier. With its Aegis's radar arrays shattered and its superstructure riddled with shrapnel, the vessel would require a tow to reach a safe port. A second destroyer would likely have expended nearly its entire magazine of Standard Missile 6 and Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, leaving it combat ineffective for any follow-on engagements against Iranian land-based missile batteries. In this hypothetical outcome, the United States Navy would hold the Strait of Hormuz, but the strategic victory would be clouded by the tactical price paid. Analysts believe that the loss of life among United States sailors would be in the dozens, if not hundreds, primarily occurring during the interlayer exchange and the missile impacts on the escort ships. This is the unsettling conclusion mentioned by wargame models. While the United States has the technology to win, the Iranian doctrine has the mass to ensure that victory is painful. Based on historical precedent, the Gerald R. Ford would likely be forced to withdraw from the Persian Gulf under its own power or assisted by tugs to undergo months of repairs at a major shipyard. In the immediate aftermath, the United States would be left with a power vacuum in the region, as its most prestigious asset is sidelined. For the Iranian side, despite the near-total loss of their flotilla, the ability to touch a United States carrier and force its withdrawal would likely be framed as a massive strategic success. The engagement would likely end not with a clear surrender, but with a tense, silent standoff as the smoke from burning fuel and high explosives drifts across the strait. The United States would have proven that its layered defense can survive a saturation attack, but the Iranian swarm would have proven that no shield is completely impenetrable. The mathematics of the swarm would have been balanced in blood, leaving both sides to reassess the future of naval warfare in restricted waters. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. The hypothetical engagement between 80 Iranian fastboats and the USS Gerald R. Ford offers critical lessons for modern naval strategy. While the United States Navy would likely hold the strait, the tactical reality of the swarm highlights vulnerabilities that cannot be solved by technology alone. Defense analysts have identified 4 key lessons from this scenario that would likely reshape future maritime doctrine. First, the magazine depth dilemma is the most significant constraint facing a carrier strike group. In this scenario, the Arleigh Burke class destroyers were forced to expend multi-million-dollar missiles to intercept craft worth a fraction of that cost. Analysis suggests that against a massed swarm, a strike group can effectively run out of bullets before the adversary runs out of boats. If this scenario were to occur, It would prove that quantity has a quality of its own in restricted waters. This has led many analysts to call for the accelerated development of directed energy or laser weapons, which offer an infinite magazine as long as the ship has power. Second, the asymmetric value gap creates a strategic imbalance. If 80 boats costing a combined $50 million can mission kill a $13 billion aircraft carrier, the cost-exchange ratio is overwhelmingly in favor of the adversary. Even if all 80 Iranian boats are destroyed, the removal of a state's carrier from the global stage for 6 months of repairs is a lopsided victory in the language of attrition. Defense analysts suggest this reality may force the United States to reconsider the footprint of its presence in the Persian Gulf, perhaps favoring smaller, more numerous littoral combat ships over a single massive target. Third, the literal trap of the Strait of Hormuz remains a geographic constant. In this hypothetical engagement, the Ford-class carrier's primary advantage, its ability to project power from hundreds of miles away, was negated by the proximity of the Iranian coastline. Analysts believe that choke points like Hormuz turn naval warfare into a knife fight in a dark room. In such an environment, the detection-to-engagement window is so short that even the most advanced automated systems can be overwhelmed by the physical speed of the incoming threats. Finally, sensor fragility is a major concern. This analysis shows that you do not need to sink a carrier to win a battle. By targeting the soft components, the radar arrays, and communication masts, an adversary can achieve a mission kill that renders the ship a non-factor in the conflict. Wargame models indicate that future carrier designs may need to prioritize redundant, armored sensor suites that can survive the hail of lead associated with a close-quarters swarm attack. In summary, this analysis teaches us that while the Aegis shield is the most capable defensive system in the world, it is not a god mode for naval warfare. In a hypothetical engagement of 80 against 1, the mathematics of the swarm are relentless. This scenario suggests that the future of naval power in the region will depend less on the size of the ship and more on the speed of the reload and the resilience of the sensors. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. Beyond the tactical exchange and the immediate damage to the ships involved, the strategic implications of such an engagement would likely reshape the global geopolitical landscape for decades. In this scenario, the primary consequence would be the sudden and violent validation of anti-access area denial strategies. If a relatively low-cost swarm could successfully mission kill a United States aircraft carrier, the perceived invincibility of large surface platforms would be fundamentally challenged. Analysis suggests that the most immediate global impact would be economic. If this engagement were to occur, the Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which 20% of the world's petroleum flows, would likely be declared a war zone and closed to commercial traffic. Wargame models predict that global oil prices would likely experience an unprecedented spike, potentially doubling in a matter of days. The realization that a single afternoon of combat could disrupt the world's energy supply would likely lead to a permanent shift in how nations manage their strategic reserves and energy security. If this scenario unfolded, the United States Navy would likely face a profound doctrine crisis. For over 70 years, the aircraft carrier has been the primary tool for American power projection. However, the heavy cost of this hypothetical victory would likely accelerate the move toward distributed lethality. This strategy emphasizes spreading offensive and defensive capabilities across a larger number of smaller, cheaper, and potentially unmanned vessels. Analysts believe that instead of one giant carrier, future deployments in restricted waters might consist of dozens of robotic surface craft and Lightning carriers carrying smaller numbers of F-35 Charlie fighters. Furthermore, the regional balance of power would likely shift in favor of asymmetric deterrence. Even if the Iranian flotilla were entirely destroyed, the fact that they successfully forced a carrier strike group to withdraw would be viewed by other regional actors as a blueprint for countering a superior military force. In this scenario, nations with limited naval budgets might move away from traditional frigates and destroyers, choosing instead to invest heavily in massed missile batteries and autonomous swarm technologies. In the United States, the political implications of heavy losses would likely be sobering. The loss of dozens of sailors and the damage to a $13 billion national asset would trigger intense debates regarding the return on investment for high-end naval platforms in the 21st century. Defense analysts have noted that the American public is accustomed to lopsided victories with minimal casualties. A victory with heavy cost could fundamentally change the domestic appetite for military intervention in the Middle East. Ultimately, this analysis concludes that the greatest weapon in the Iranian arsenal is not the fast boat itself, but the math of saturation. If this engagement were to occur, it would prove that even the most advanced shield can be cracked if the adversary is willing to throw enough stones. The Gerald R. Ford might survive the battle, but the era of the uncontested sea would likely be over. This analysis has examined a hypothetical engagement based on known military doctrine and publicly available technical data. In reality, the outcome of such a conflict would be influenced by 1,000 variables, from weather conditions to individual acts of bravery that no model can fully capture. This is a hypothetical scenario designed to explore the limits of modern naval technology and the persistent threat of asymmetric warfare.